welcome to Behind the Design, a podcast style after show that we're going to be doing here on That Works Too. That's going to give a little bit more in-depth look into some builds that we feel like maybe we didn't cover as much as we wanted to in the build because they can't all be an hour long. Not all of our build videos will have these videos, but this is a good start with the build that we have today, which is our Italian Halberd. Now, a brief history of how this kind of came into being is that Ilya wanted to make a poleaxe or a halberd since like mid-February. It was actually a little before that. And one of our friends who's a craftsman who's kind of dove into how to do those poleaxes, how to put them together, how to forge weld them. And we asked him if he'd be interested in doing it, and he seemed very interested, but
flaked.
Yeah, as it kind of progressed, some other projects, I guess he felt were conflicting, so that didn't end up happening. So probably late February, we decided we were going to do a pole axe or a halberd, and the most requested build to date for a historical item on our channel was a halberd. So we kind of started leaning towards that. Now, we planned on getting right in on it early March, but we got a sponsored build to do something from Black Desert Online, Draconia's sword, so that kind of pushed things back. And in the meantime, the people from Outward reached out to us, and they wanted us to make this elaborate, crazy design. They sent us a couple choices, and we were going to do this one called the thrice wrought halberd, which is like, you'd say kind of like a church window design with some like traditional forged...
Fantasy. It's fantasy.
Fantasy, but it had some traditional like forged gate aspects. And
looks like someone took a piece of stained glass window, beat out all the glass, and whatever you have left turned into a halberd.
Yeah, and we thought we could show some pretty cool techniques in that, but it ended up that another creator actually made that. And when we looked at other stuff that we could make from the game, one of the nice things we noticed is there's historical weapons, and one of the main weapons in that game is a halberd. So we kind of went from there and decided we were going to do that. And when that all came to conclusion, when we finished that build, it was time to start on this. We're both working on Blade Show projects. There wasn't much time, but because we really wanted to make that build, we decided to go ahead and squeeze it in before Blade Show. Now, Ilya, why don't you give us a brief idea of like the mindset and what kind of research you did to decide how you were going to make this halberd?
Well, first of all, the number one requested build is actually general pole weapon, and then out of all of those, the number one is the halberd. Now, we could have made the halberd by MIG welding a whole bunch of pre-cut blanks and called it a halberd, but then there's no interest to me in doing something like that. You can just buy one on Amazon, and at the same time, that doesn't really convey what a halberd is. Whenever I look at a historical item, to me it's primarily an object of culture. What kind of industry had to exist to manufacture it, what kind of basic material knowledge existed, and what kind of skill level was required to mass produce the item. So to me, I started looking more and more at historical halberds, especially munitions grade pieces, because unlike other parts of the world, in Europe, the nicest weapons were the same weapons as munitions grade, except they were sent to a polishing facility with an extra step and sent to a better jeweler to encrust. We know about that because of London contracts to the polishers in terms of armor, and the job of the polisher, I think, was cost 7 times more than the cost of the piece of armor, and we can infer from that
Wow.
You just take munitions grade stuff that is on the nicer side and send it to get upgraded. It almost feels like one of those video game kind of upgrades.
Sure.
And to a certain extent it was, unless you're dealing with a custom armor like Helmschmidt, Negroli, or something like that. So, started looking at munitions grade halberds with one specific reason. I needed to know how those pieces were plausibly assembled together. Of course, there would have been cultural differences. Of course, the way the Germans would have been assembling their halberds would have been slightly different from the English, the Italians, the Swiss. There would have been regional as well as guild differences because we're dealing with a guild system. What I looked for specifically were mistakes. You look for incompletions, weld flaws, cracks. You look at various angles, the way the socket is and where it's not quite pushed together. And after I had a complete picture of what I think a plausible interpretation for making a halberd of any kind looks like, I said, you know, I kind of like the Italian halberds. They're a little bit cooler, and Italian halberds are part of a modern uniform for the Swiss Guard in the Vatican. So if you go on a good day, you see a whole bunch of Swiss Guards standing outside of St. Peter's with their halberds. So those are smaller, though.
And to give a little context, when he says he researched, like sometimes for Man at Arms, we would get our build list like 2 days before we filmed, and we would go home and Google overnight. That's not what this was at all. It was over the course of like a month. I would be at home and I would get a Instagram direct message from Ilya of like, look, I found this example. I found this example. And
Look at this crack.
Look at this crack.
flaw.
He would zoom in. He'd take a screenshot, and that went on for at least a month before we even started, of all kinds of different little things where you'd see the top spike forge welded. Sometimes there would be like where you'd see the square socket flared out and you could see the whole perimeter of that forge weld where it was, you know, the material got thin and you could see where that forge weld happened. And so it wasn't like
I was
quick.
looking for bad jobs because the bad jobs indicate the direction in which a good job goes.
Right. Now, you hinted on it just a second ago, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So for some of you who don't know, when I edit these videos, I often jump in our Discord channel. There is a That Works Discord channel. I'll put the link in the description. And I sometimes live edit so people can come in and talk to me.
I don't know what Discord is.
It's all
like,
good.
I barely use
It's all good, I do. So I'll be live editing the videos, and I'll let people come in and watch me actually stream. And I get their feedback. Should I cut this? Should I cut that? Sometimes only 2 or 3 people come in. Sometimes 20 people come in. But one of the things people did ask, and I answered them, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you. You kind of hinted on it, but they were wondering why we chose specifically the Italian halberd over, say, you know, a Scottish halberd or, you know, all kinds of other things. Now, you said it was...
Scotland is a land of warrior poets who never won a war, and the poetry is so-so. So I don't... Like, the halberds are probably in the same category.
My answer was...
The Italians, although gave us Bernini, gave us Michelangelo,
Yeah.
gave us amazing poetry, art. Like, I went with the Italian
Now,
school.
that's kind of his personal view on it, but also... from the game, we only had like a little teeny picture to work from these halberds and some like a little bit of footage, and the at least perimeter, the outline, the rough shape of the iron halberd in outward looked very much like an Italian one.
Yep, that's also why we immediately attached this sponsor, because my policy, my general view of the channel is anytime we can do a historical build, we should be biased towards a historical build because we get to talk about culture and actual technique. And if there's a historical build in mind and then there's a sponsor who we can kind of bully or cajole into sponsoring something we already want to make, we're going to do it. And I think it brings more value to the viewer to talk about culture, to talk about there's a stereotype of the Western blacksmith who is forging a sword all by himself. First of all, blacksmiths don't make swords. Blacksmiths make other stuff, railings, but bladesmiths make swords, and cutlers make all the rest. And there's a stereotype that it's the person alone doing that. No, in fact, there was a giant industry in high Middle Ages and all the way into the Renaissance and all the way to modern times of manufacturing things. So if you think you're going to be a blade maker, you're just making blade preforms and sending it out to someone else. You don't get to finish your stuff. Guards and pommels for swords, for example, would have been sold by the barrel and shipped from France to England, and then you just hodgepodge fit them together somehow.
Right. Yeah, certainly there were custom pieces that wasn't the case, but military speaking, for sure.
They're statistically insignificant.
Sure, exactly. So another question that I got on Discord that I actually didn't answer for you, I said I would ask you. A lot of times I feel comfortable kind of putting myself in Ilya's shoes and answering it. but I feel like this one is specifically for you. So you did a lot of research about how these halberds were made. You've held halberds before.
Yes.
You've been to museums, you've seen them, so
Yes.
you had a pre-existing notion of them. But is there anything that stands out after you've built one now? Because you pretty much built this whole thing. I was kind of just a helper, a player in the grinding area. I didn't do too much on it. So is there anything that really kind of stands out to you that you feel like you learned about halberds and making them
Well,
that you didn't have when you went in?
it was probably the you're in the doghouse job to assemble halberds because they're incredibly obnoxious.
Yeah.
And to come up with these shapes, like as the person designing items of war or defense or for the guards, that is one of the most obnoxious shape. It gets worse. They get much worse.
Sure.
To decide, I'm going to make this, I'm going to assemble it, and guess what? Let a whole bunch of people stub their toes on them while the workshop is dark. It is the thought process behind designing things with a lot of spikes and a lot of hooks on it is completely incomprehensible to me because the function of this can be performed quite as well with something that is
spike
not
and a
as
ball.
spiky.
A spike and a ball.
Spike and a ball.
Yeah.
Spike and a ball and a tiny axe, and good
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
But this obviously follows primarily the need for fashion. As well, actually, in Europe, most weapons do.
Yeah.
My argument against most people who talk about weapons is that much more of weapon designs are driven by fashion rather than advancement in armor or practical use. They're much more driven by fashion, and they're much more highly correlated to changes in the overall shape of architecture
Yeah.
than in developments of materials or armor.
Yeah, I actually just did a podcast last week where that actually slipped my mind, where I talked about evolution because of armor and what they were going up against. Yeah. And your point when we did the armor talk of fashion and armor is like super clear. Like weapons, you might have like a little kickback, but armor, when you see the pleats and the clothing of the time and the mimicked in the steel, it's really, really obvious.
I mean, this looks like a piece of crochet.
Sure.
Like, and this is when they started being like that is around the time they started adding as a part of standard clothing for even the lowest soldier, a little bit of crochet sleeve here or in a collar. There you go.
Now let me ask you a question. So one thing I do kind of question / clarification statement. So a lot of times when we make axes or pole arms or anything like that, you see us kind of fighting through the process and kind of figuring things out as we go. We're built to make hammers. We're tooled up to make bladesmithing hammers and to make swords here at this shop. That's really what we do. We're not really tooled up like you see other axe makers where they have all the jigs and stuff. In your opinion, like a shop that was making this, you saw in the video Ilya holding a top tool, and I did a lot of striking for him. Do you think there would have been more kind of free flow like that, or would they have had swages and stuff predetermined, making a ton
one of the things that made this build more complicated than it needed to be is because Chris sold the one swage I wanted the shop to keep and kept the swage I didn't care much about. So he sold the good one. You're always supposed to keep the good stuff for yourself. That's my policy. But because it had the perfect outlines where I could have forged the socket in. Now, you looking at people in the medieval era who from early morning until sundown, that's all they do. Life is not exciting. They're not having fun. That's all they do. And the more of those things they make, let's call them widget, like economics, the better they get paid. Most of the labor is unpaid. Apprentices start getting paid only after whatever year. But they just get bread, water, sometimes wine, because water is unreliable, and they work. So you have a lot of cheap labor that just does one thing specifically, and they learn how to do it very well and very fast. I suspect that a workshop would have been cranking out about 20 preforms per day ready for the person who's on the grinding wheel across the street.
Yeah.
to shape them. We're like forge welded, boom, done.
And you think they would have tooled up more so than free forging with a hammer?
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
they would not. Yes, they would have been tooled up, or at least they would have developed a set of behavioral tools to make them faster. But it's minimum 20 per day.
Yeah. So like we're not going to always take a week to tool up on a process where we make a bunch. We're kind of like going into it pretty cold, even though we did a bunch of research. We're going into it kind of cold on some of these one-off weapons. So some of the process you saw probably wouldn't have been exact, but the shapes in general and how they went together were pretty spot on.
Yeah, I'm not planning on making 20, 30 of these. I'll probably make one for a blade show some years down the line, and that's it.
Yeah.
And I'll make the shaft only this long, so it's just
Sure.
a spike and a big halberd axe.
So one thing you got to mention briefly in the video was the fact that the wrought iron we picked actually had a fair amount of carbon in it that we found out when we took it to the grinder for the first time. Would you say that normally something like that would have been made out of iron or wrought iron, if you will, and then had a forge welded high carbon edge, or the edge isn't as needed on a weapon like this, and they probably would have only saved the higher carbon for the spike?
You don't even need edge retention on an item like that. It does its job just as well if it's iron or steel. It just does. Now, that is a much more complicated topic because, as anyone with any experience and thought process behind their work with charcoal or coal knows, that your iron gets saturated with carbon if you work in the medium correctly and for long enough. So what starts out as iron, and when it's forged in a certain way, absorbs the carbon from the forge. It doesn't work in a gas forge. It does not work in a gas forge. Well, do not like. It's a completely different cementization. Is a different process when you're doing it in a gas forge. Now, I used to not believe that iron picks up naturally carbon from charcoal or coal, like as you forge with it. I used to not believe it, but it's obviously the case, especially when you bring pieces to forge welding temperature. There's just it's as clear as day, and things don't have to be super hard. Because we're using modern materials right now and buy modern swords made from space age steels, we think, we
maximum hardness.
We need 57, 60 Rockwell for my sword, and it has the spring. No, like it's beyond. You're multiplying beyond necessity a set of parameters that the item has to kill flesh. The hardest thing in your body are your teeth, and they are not as hard as pure iron.
Sure.
So you don't need to make them out of high carbon. This probably you do because you're dealing with some people with armor, so probably this much of it needs to kind of not bend. But everything else...
Even so, I bet you there's a lot of halberds that got bent.
Oh yeah.
They just need to poke once, right?
They just need to poke once. Yeah. And they don't need to poke far. That's one of the things. People who test weapons on YouTube say, this sword is much better at thrusting because it penetrates this far in, and the other one penetrates only this far in. Well, this is still other side of the rib cage. But this one now you have to pull out on the out motion this much, and this one barely any.
Right.
So our modern tendency that penetration power, the more of it, the better, therefore the weapon is more effective. No, there's a diminishing marginal utility effect.
Right.
Like imagine a conceptual sword, like an abstract mathematical object, that as soon as you thrust a person, it penetrates the body 4 miles. Right now you have 4 miles to pull out. It's obviously an ineffective sword.
Right. Well, since you mentioned weapons testing, let's talk about the demo real quick. So when we demo, if you want to call it demo, usually the end of the video, sometimes mixed in the beauty shots, these weapons in general, whether it's fantasy or this, we're kind of not necessarily testing them. We're just putting on a show. But for the historical ones, we do like to show something that has importance. That's why we use some chainmail in this
Riveted
demo.
chainmail.
But in reality, if we were doing this weapon truth, we probably would have had somebody on horseback and showed you pulling them off. It was probably not used like I cut right through a water jug. Probably are never going to be swinging a halberd horizontally like this.
It's
Yeah,
these
it's
are
a
clear. So
hook,
the
a push.
last time when I studied HEMA, there was one manual that was the most authoritative source on using the halberd specifically, and that's the Vatican Guard Manual. And the Vatican Guard Manual stressed, the way I remember, is hooking ankles, knees, elbows. So this is more like a fireman's hook
Mm-hmm.
than it is like an axe.
Sure.
Obviously, it is an axe, but it's primarily a debilitating weapon, except for the spike. The spike is obviously like a bayonet or a spear.
Sure.
Yeah, so even up until the Second World War, people fenced with rifles with bayonets attached to them, and that martial art is very similar to either spear or halberd martial art. In fact, as a craftsman, the more you study historical items, the more it becomes the case that people did not design an item to fit a specific martial arts need, but kind of the other way around. Someone came up with a bunch of items, someone commissioned a whole bunch of them for the army, and then the martial art was made to fit that. And it seems to be more consistent anthropologically because the first weapons were sticks. So it can't be the case that someone came up with sticks and branches so that to fit a stick martial art. No, someone found a stick and figured out the best way to beat someone over the head with it.
That's a good point. So while we're on the topic of the demo, we had a little fun with this demo. We came up with a gag, and I say we, it was Ilya, of me kind of running through the field Monty Python style. And I was like, okay, we'll do it. Funny thing is, though, I actually ran through the field a lot more than you guys got to see.
I forgot to press the record button.
Yeah, when I went to edit, I was like, oh, I'm going to have so much footage. I was tired. And yeah, so 3 or 4 of those takes where I actually ran from scene to scene that we were going to cut back and forth didn't get recorded, Ilya.
You would not have complained as much if you would not have been skipping leg day.
Oh, I feel like you probably set me up a little bit there just to get me active and running. So I appreciate that gag.
You're welcome.
That was fun.
I charge.
You charge. Is there anything else you want to add that you learned from this build that you'd like people to know about it?
To me as a craftsman, I learned what kind of making strategy people had to embark on. Like first you do this and then that, because if you reverse it and make the blade absolutely perfect, then you don't have room for error or you can't attach a socket. Things like that. To the viewer, I would recommend looking more into standard issue munitions weapons if you're interested in weapons, and as a source of your inspiration, and keep in mind the boundary conditions of available materials. Do not glorify the items you're looking at, because odds are they were, by modern standard, very bad materials. That doesn't mean the materials were very bad. It means our standards have shifted, so we use retrospective modernism and looking back at historical items and saying, well, this is how they used them. And as a maker, I can say, well, there's no possible way they would have used it as a matter of habit like that, because then you would have had a tremendous rate of failure and means tremendous budget drain on a standard issue item.
Sure. Now, one question that I actually asked you while we were making it, and we didn't actually show in the video itself, is the etching process that we did. So you saw him painting on the resist. We then soaked the whole thing in ferric chloride and let it sit there for an hour and a half or whatever it was to bring out the design, and consequently it also brought out some of the wrought iron folded pattern. How exactly would they have done that?
Acid. That's the obvious answer. Now, your question is, how did they get acid? Well, one way of doing it is concentrated vinegar, and they certainly knew how to distill vinegar. So, and in some places in the world, you can buy 70%, 80% concentrated vinegar. You can use sulfuric acid and nitric acid. Remember, you have a couple thousand years worth of alchemy by then, and if nothing else, alchemists were very good at discovering cool new substances that they knew nothing really about.
That would kill people.
That would kill people.
Yeah.
You can make sulfuric acid at home. That's pretty easy. You just have to buy sulfur and a whole bunch of weird jugs to make sure that the sulfur oxide goes through water, especially if it is peroxide, and as it bubbles, you slowly build up sulfuric acid. It's not that difficult. In fact, you can go find sulfur, raw sulfur, in a cave, come home and do it. There are plenty of people who have done it. Nitric acid, you can also make it. It's incredibly dangerous, and if you inhale it, you're screwed. Permanent damage to the lungs, eyes, but people didn't live long in the medieval era to begin with, precisely because of that. But you can use manure that has natural acids as it ferments, so to speak. You can use stomach acids of various animals, which is usually based on hydrochloric acid plus some enzymes.
So there basically was numerous.
There were numerous ways of eating away at metal.
All right, last question while we're on the topic of etching is also something I asked you, but also came from our Discord. We had a viewing party, a watch party of the live premiere where people got to come in and ask me questions, and then afterwards I stayed for about 20 minutes and answered the questions. And one of the questions they asked me is one that I also asked you. I answered it, but I'm going to have you answer it as well, is if they're etching this design onto it, how come we don't see more pieces in museums that show the layering, like, you know, the Damascus-esque pattern?
Well, one of the reasons is we etched it in ferric, and the way ferric etches, it is incredibly conducive to showing the actual patterning rather than eating away at the material. Another reason is for the most of human history, when there was no monosteel, so by default all iron, all steel was folded and had a pattern. And the goal was, especially in Europe, to not reveal patterning, to hide it, to burnish it over. So once you etch the design with an acid that tends to etch much faster than ferric and not reveal as much pattern, you use sand to color in the background, to polish over the background to not reveal as many weld flaws that are in it usually. Hence, that's why I looked at the bad ones. Second, you also use ink, just like modern engravers do, to hide it. So there's a whole system of practices that would have hidden the design, as well as continuous cleaning with, quite frankly, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, where people started developing interest in medieval weapons, they also destroyed a lot of them by using bad conservation methods, of using basically steel wool and God knows what,
right,
to clean over that.
Yeah. Now, the second part of that question from a Discord user was, why did we etch it and leave it etched? And I'll go ahead and answer that. Literally, part of this whole exercise that we did of making this and showing you how it's constructed is so that in the end you could still see it. So you can see where the different kinds of iron are here and here, the highly folded stuff in the socket, the not folded stuff here in the langettes and such. So we were leaving some of that evidence that you could see very blatantly in the steel itself in the finished product. That's why we didn't go ahead and polish it out. Now I just want to go ahead and thank you guys for watching this video or listening to this podcast, whichever way you're doing it. We're going to be doing more on this channel, That Works Too. If you have not seen the full build episode over on our main channel, please check out the link in the description and go check it out. Anything else?
No, that would be it.
Thanks for watching, guys.